So this morning, we have this story of the coming of the wise men. And it's a tricky story. In some ways, it feels like two stories. On the one hand, there's the story of the wise men and the star. On the other hand, there's the story about tyrants and places that we explain. So as modern people of science, we probably have some difficulty with the star story because, well, this story wants us to believe that some astrologers, magi were astrologers, figured out on the basis of a rising of a star, not only that a particular baby was born to be king, but exactly where, like which country this baby was going to be king of. And they figured this out on the basis of a rising of a star. Right? Now, the Bible contains lots of ways of people getting new knowledge, right? Divine revelation, like God says, angels show up. Right? Even like later on in the story, the Magi find something out because they hear in a dream. Right? In there, that one makes sense. But astrology? Right? That was a bit tricky. And then of course, as Mary Angel noticed yesterday, right? This star thing. Right? I mean, like sure having one here, we could maybe figure out, but how do we imagine a star stopping over a village? Because stars don't stop over villages. They're like, way out there somewhere, and if you just move over, that suddenly they're no longer over that village. How does it make sense of this story? On the other hand, this is a story about real things, about real kings and real places, right? So in some ways, this story feels like a parable. Right? A sower went out to sow, Jesus said, and as he sowed his seed, some fell on this kind of ground, and some fell on that kind of ground. And when we hear a parable, we know there's certain questions we're not really supposed to ask. We don't ask, like, what's the guy's name? Or what kind of seed is he planted? Or why is he so bad at this? Right? This is the point of the story, we don't worry about that. But in this story, right, there's enough historical details that we start to wonder. Now, the story doesn't provide, say, the names of the Magi, but tradition does. There's traditions about the names that these folks had, and they're about real stuff. And part of the problem with treating the whole thing like it's a parable, like it's a metaphor, is that at some point then the whole thing, the whole Bible becomes just a metaphor. Right? And then if the star is a metaphor, then is Herod a metaphor and Bethlehem? And ultimately Jesus becomes just a metaphor for something. And our whole faith just becomes a metaphor for something rather than something we concretely live in a real one. There are enough details in this story to keep it from becoming completely a metaphor. Right? Herod was a real king. It talks about Bethlehem of Judea. Very clear about that a number of times. Bethlehem of Judea, that Bethlehem, real place, right? There's an actual space. Herod's a real king in a real city. But even these are very remote from us, right? So, for example, kings. Yes, we understand about kings, but I'm guessing if today you're in a conversation about kings, you're talking about one of three things. The first is you could be talking about Shakespeare. There's lots of kings in Shakespeare, right? And there's certainly no doubt some of you here to have extended conversations about the various kings in Shakespeare. You could be talking about Disney, lots of kings in Disney, right? More princesses than princes, but behind a prince and a princess, somewhere there's a king. Right? Or you could be talking about some small African country that you couldn't find on a map anyway. Right? But none of those things are really real here in modern America. Or something like Bethlehem. Right? When you think about Bethlehem, you get to like old little town up pretty quickly. And stories about Jesus, but like very few of us here have been to Bethlehem and understand it as a real concrete place. So, sort of like when I was growing up, I knew in some sense that there was this place called West Virginia, right? And it was easy to remember because it was sort of funny, right? West Virginia, like, where's East Virginia? But that would have been like the sum total of my knowledge about West Virginia, is that it was on a map, you know. Was it real? I don't know, but it was on a map. And I think Bethlehem is that way for many of us, that if I ask you to name one fact about modern Bethlehem, most of you would struggle. You might say something like, well, it's in Israel, and you'd be wrong. It isn't. And that's not a good start. Right? And so, right? Or, you know, we get to, at the end, we get to frankincense and myrrh. And once a year, we go, okay, and I put this up again. What is a frankincense and myrrh again? So at some point, eventually, there's this temptation just to remove this whole story from real events. Because even the real parts of this story feel quite disconnected and remote. So I don't want to try to make this more historical for you because it's just hard to do that because it's just more words. That's all I got this morning, is more words. So maybe what we could do instead is compare this story to other stories, the stories we know, and understand that our world is full of stories, and somehow we have to choose. Deb and I this last week have been watching, off and on at least, the Colin Kaepernick story. So for those of you who don't know who he is, he's an NFL quarterback, or he used to be an NFL quarterback, but he was the guy who started kneeling at the national anthem. And so because of that, he got unofficially banned from the NFL. And while they never officially admitted it, they have teams in the NFL continue to play truly, truly horrible quarterbacks rather than signing him to a contract, because he's honest about what it means to be black in the NFL, and they can't have that. So this whole story about sports being the great equalizer and everybody having the same opportunity, Kaepernick stands out as this huge voice saying, no, that's not actually true. It's just a myth. Not so many stories. I grew up with the story that church people were better than other people. Good people went to church, not good people didn't go to church. The world was nice and simple. Right? And this story was very comfortable for me because I went to church. But looking back on it, it also meant that a story like that supported institutional power over individuals. And it meant that sometimes leaders got away with really horrible stuff because you couldn't say anything bad about someone who was a good church-going person, especially if they were a leadership. We have other stories. We try to teach the kids this story that you can be anything you want, which is utter nonsense. But we keep saying it over and over and over again to kids. I hear it a lot. We keep telling one another that if you work hard, you will succeed. Or, to be more honest, if you work hard, you will be tired all the time. Or if you take Jesus as an example, if you work hard, you could end up dying on a cross. Like what we just read from Paul. Paul offers this great future to Timothy. Join me in suffering for the gospel. That was the big opportunity that Timothy was being given. You too could suffer. Very different from ours, right? Or, even this idea that material success is the only goal that's worth striving for. That's the one. Someone succeeded. In church, sometimes we like this story that God will come someday and fix everything and make it all better. Keeping in mind that the Jesus story doesn't work that way. Jesus died on the cross. Jesus was tortured to death. So we live in a world full of guiding stories. And we have to choose our guiding stories and recognize that some of them just aren't true over and over and over again, and yet we hang on to them. This story, the King's story, the Jesus story, is about tyrants and power. Well, we may not quite have figured out the star part. We know all about political power and what it does to people. And we live we prefer the story that, well, if they had democracy, things would all be better. But we know what that story is like too. This story is also about figuring out what is worth worshiping. And we just went through Christmas, and Christmas is so confusing. Because Christmas, on the one hand, is all about getting more stuff, and on the other hand, is about love and joy and peace and hope. Love, of course, being mostly here about either romantic love or love for your family, but at least love. And there's this new Santa now where everybody is apparently good, nobody gets cold anymore, which means, of course, that people who get big stuff are automatically better than people who get little stuff, and so the rich deserve the Lexus they got. Hopefully nobody here got a Lexus. Not worried. This story is also about honoring wisdom we don't understand. Right? These magi, they show up. And I'm sure somebody in Herod's court went, I don't believe this story, you guys are all not school. That's not what actually happened. Right? In the story, no, somebody took them seriously, even though, like, what would you do? Three foreigners came into church here, said, we're looking for something, looking for somebody because we do astrology. What would we say? Exactly what we'd say. Which I think is why we need to keep coming back to these old stories. Because they still have something for us. They still have a challenge for us in our quasi-scientific 21st century North American book. In some ways, the question is not, do we believe these old stories? The question is, do we believe our own? And whether or not our stories are even worth listening to again. Amen. So our last song is not a Christmas song, it's a Jesus song. And it might be new, but we'll struggle our way through it like we often do. So it's in Voices Together, number 270, In the Beginning.